Today's episode is brought to you by Achieve Unite, a global leader in leadership development, business acceleration, and trusted partnerships. Achieve Unite combines deep expertise, data analytics, and AI to help companies accelerate revenue, control costs, elevate talent, and build trust. They're more than advisors. They deliver results with their proven three-part approach: talent development, ecosystem strategy, and profitable growth programs. Whether you're strengthening alliances, enhancing internal systems, or optimizing your partner ecosystem, Achieve Unite is the partner you need for success. Ready to elevate your CX leadership? The Trusted Guide Roadmap Masterclass returns on February 12th. This live, hands-on program equips you with proven frameworks to build a CX roadmap, gain executive buy-in, and drive measurable results. Seats are limited, so don't miss your chance to connect with CX leaders driving change. Visit empoweredcx.com to register today. Welcome to the Delighted Customers Podcast. I am so glad you're here. We challenge conventional thinking about customer experience because I believe that improving experiences isn't just good for business. It's a powerful way to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. Each week, we feature thought-provoking conversations with industry thought leaders from a variety of backgrounds, offering unique perspectives and actionable insights. Get ready to sharpen your leadership and transform your approach to customer experience. Let's dive in. Well, today's guest comes all the way from the other side of the pond in Europe. I'm so excited to have guests from Europe and especially Switzerland. So excited to have Dr. Maxie Schmidt, who is a principal analyst in Forrester's customer experience practice. She leads Forrester's research on CX measurement and value for customer. And in her role, she advises leaders on how to build effective CX measurement programs, make the case for CX, and co-create value with customers. And also she got her doctorate at the School of Business in Ingolstadt. Am I saying that right, Maxie?
Yes. Yes.
In Germany. So Maxie,
Yes.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
I am so excited. Love the power of technology that we can be halfway around the world and seem like we're in the same room.
Yes.
Today, I really have a scientist on the show, and we're going to be talking about this idea of customer value metrics and understanding what customers truly value so we can end up with better business outcomes. So when we start talking about this topic, Maxie, could you help level set for the audience when we say customer value metrics? What is it and why has it been an issue?
So we have a lot of companies who want to keep their customers.
Yeah.
And the best way to do that is that customers feel that there's some value for them. And I don't mean value as in the price is low. We can talk about that. But do customers feel that they're getting value from doing business with a company? And that's really important. We don't have all that good metrics to measure that. And many companies use proxies. For example, software companies will use the number of features that you use or the number of logins. But that doesn't necessarily mean that a customer's gotten value. And then these same companies will talk about how they are delivering this superior value to the customer. And as we talked about, you can't even deliver value to a customer because it's a perception of that customer, and that customer co-creates the value with you. If the customer doesn't put their information or doesn't bring whatever they need to do with them, nothing can be created. So there's this idea of perception and co-creation, and that makes it really hard to measure the value that a customer is getting from doing business with you.
So you're already touching on some things that are going to force people who are listening to the show to expand their mindset. And so let's, if you don't mind me double tapping on a couple of things you said. Co-creation. So what can that look like? And can you give me maybe an illustration or example of what a co-created experience that brings customer value looks like?
Yeah, so when we talk about co-creation in a customer experience or design sense, we often talk about co-creating a new product together.
Right.
That's not exactly what I mean. What I mean here is that think about this podcast. This podcast, right? We are co-creating value with the audience. So, for example, you and I are having a conversation. We talked about what we would like to talk about. What are the main points? What would we like to bring across? How would we like the audience to feel? And that's our part of co-creation. But there's also an audience. And if they turn us on while they also watch TV, they're not going to get something from this, right? So they have to bring their attention to get something out of this podcast, but they're also bringing their mental models, their assumptions, their interests, their questions. So they bring a lot to this. We bring a lot to this, and in fact, we're probably creating something new here. So you and I are not creating a little package of podcasts that gets shipped over the digital wires to a customer, but by the act of us talking and the audience listening, they have new insights, we have new insights, and something new gets created, gets co-created. And there's some value of it for both sides. We, for example, having a great discussion and probably some like, oh, wow, hadn't thought about it this way, hadn't said it this way. And the audience might be like, oh, yeah, that's a new thing. Or, yeah, good thing that they also talk about this. And so that's what I'm just, this small example is what I mean by co-creating value.
Yeah. So not the typical, hey, help us create a new product together and product design stuff. You're talking about the actual engagement from the customer side in utilizing. I think about, I used to work at a bank, and people who particularly retail customers who interact with the bank, can now create how they want their experience to look. Like they can create which page comes up first and which fields come, because they may not care about certain things, but they may care a lot about other things. Would that be a good example of co-creation in an experience?
Yeah, they're co-creating with us what the experience should look like. And of course, there's lots of examples that also, I think academia over the last 20 years has studied this a lot, because in most cases, when a company and the customer work together to accomplish some customer goal, the customer has to be a big part of it. Think about healthcare. If I go into a situation with negative energy and not willing to listen to advice and not taking any medication, then of course the doctor can't deliver value via a pill. The pill does not have inherent value. The value gets created when I take it, when the dose is right. So that's one part of that. But there's of course also more interesting applications of this, like you talked about the fact that customers can co-create their products. There's companies out there like Haier, the Chinese manufacturer of white goods. And they do lots of things, but customers actually have an influence on what that product looks like in the end, because they're involved in the creation of it. But this is not like, this is a very specific case. I think all of the people who might listen to this podcast work for companies where even now a customer and the company have to both bring something into the relationship to create something new together. And it's not a kind of value gets delivered because I create a bucket of things and I send it to you.
Yeah. So that was the first part of what you said, was this idea, one of the parts. The other part was co-creation, but the other part was creating value and how difficult it is to measure. And one of the things you said was it was because it's in the perception of the customer's eyes or through their lens of what the perceived value is. So what can just not getting into driving more value for customers, but what we can even begin to do to measure the value that we're delivering for customers better.
Yes. So you mean the value that customers think they're getting, right?
Yeah.
Yes. When I did my research on metrics for value, I found a lot of companies who had big assumptions on what creates value, and then they were measuring the proxies. I mentioned this earlier, like feature usage, logins, and so on and so on. And these assumptions could be right, or they could be wrong. But we do have to test it. So actually that research I've done then ended up going in a wholly different direction in how to understand what customers actually value. And how do I understand what drives the most value for them? Is it that the product is cheap or is easy to use? Or is it that the employee is super empathetic? Or is it that it makes me look really good and amazing and special? Or there's some self-affirmation? So that's the first thing, so the drivers of value. And the second thing that I think is super interesting for us as companies is that this kind of research also tells you, where do customers want you? as they're trying to accomplish a goal. I'll give you an example. A real example, when somebody wants to protect their home, for example, with an insurance. So they have a property and casualty insurance that protects whatever valuable things are in their home. And many of the insurances that offer this kind of service also offered apps in which you could create an inventory of your belongings. But over time, all these apps or functionality within apps got shut down because the customer doesn't want that insurance company to do that for them. They don't want to co-create that value with the insurance company. There's other apps that are still online, that are still working, that you can use to create your inventory. But if you are anyway thinking about switching every year, like why would you have your inventory with that specific app? So this is this idea that where do customers even want you to play? There was another interesting example that was from AARP, and many of the US listeners will know them as kind of like I'm going to call it an interest organization for people over 50.
Right.
And which did research trying to find out where do customers want AARP to play a role. So for example, if you are an AARP member or you have a mother who is and that mother dies, right? They could have said, we offer everything, grief counseling, this and that. But they realized that customers or members were not really interested in all of these aspects because they didn't think that AARP had either the knowledge or the permission or just felt right to do these things. And so grief counseling, no, it's okay. I'll do that with some kind of psychiatrist or psychologist, but give me that checklist and help me to quickly resolve all of the accounts that I have that this person has. That would be something that I want from AARP. So basically the two parts are the drivers of value. But then it's also where do customers want you to play?
That is really fascinating. So if you are a leader, business leader, and you're not asking those two questions, maybe you should be.
Yeah, because it's easy. And you and I talked offline a little bit about technology for technology's sake. And sometimes we see this that we're saying, we should offer this new functionality, this new feature, because that's something that's really interesting. But there's two problems with that. First of all, for a customer to want to do more with you, to let them into their lives more than they do, they need to trust you 100%, right? And second, are you in the best position to do that well? I'll give you an example from Asia. DBS, a really quite famous bank in Singapore who is famous for their customer experience efforts, for their digitalization excellence. They, for example, realized that when a customer wants to buy a car, that is really complicated in Singapore, right? It's complicated everywhere, but it's even more complicated in Singapore. Okay. And so DBS knew that the customers trusted it. So first of all, they had earned trust by being a good bank for these customers. And now they could think, okay, now that we've earned the trust, why don't we look at a few customer issues that they want to solve? Like, for example, buying a car, where a customer has to interact with many different people or organizations to do that. Right? They have to interact with the car seller, maybe with a platform, with an insurance company, with a lender. In Singapore, they also have to interact with the government because you have to get a license to even own a car there. And it's really complicated. And so DBS was saying, you know what, we are at the prime position. Customers trust us. So we could maybe orchestrate some of that. And all of these actors that I just described, imagine them around that customer, right? The customer that wants to just be mobile. And because they want to buy a car, but let's say be mobile, there's all these different like insurance company, lender, car company, and so on. DBS as a bank is one of them. But then they were thinking, okay, what could we help the customer to do more simply? So they created a marketplace where you could find cars. They helped you to figure out how to do the purchase of the cars. They helped you to figure out how to get insurance for the cars. They do this all in one platform. So as a DBS customer, you go to this platform and you don't need to have all these other interactions with these other parties. So that makes your life much easier, which means that now DBS plays a larger role in your life, but not because they said, we can do all of these things, but because they figured out what is complicated for customers and how could we help. By the way, the licensing thing with the government, I think that's still on the customer because that's something that DBS can't do. So they've also understood that that's probably not some place they want to play, but they've looked at this whole value network for the customer and figured out where they should be playing and facilitating for the customer.
Yeah, so I'm hoping there's some sparks triggering from some of the listeners thinking outside the box a bit about how they can play a role in providing value based on how customers, their journey is and what they're trying to achieve. As you mentioned,
Right.
jobs to be done, and maybe some areas where they think they might be helpful, but there's no value there.
Correct. Exactly. And that is, of course, not just a question of, oh, we shouldn't play there and the customer doesn't want us there, but it costs you money to play everywhere. And if you can identify better where you should and shouldn't play, that's huge.
So let's talk a little bit more about what's the big deal is what I like to call it, and I'm talking specifically about those decision makers in the C-suite. A couple of things, as you've shared, and I would appreciate if you would expand on this a little bit more, but it seems to me like, if you're fishing in the wrong waters, where you're wasting your time and energy because customers really aren't going to perceive value in that particular aspect of what you're providing, and also you may be missing an opportunity where you could be leveraging the trust that you have earned, and you're in a strategically beneficial position to be assistance, as you gave an example of DBS. Why, that's just me sharing, but why do you think it is such a big deal and this idea of understanding value creation on the side of the customer should matter so much to the C-suite?
So how many times do you go for a beer with a friend who always lets you pay, Mark? So if I was your friend and you'd always leave before we pay, at some point I'd not invite you for the beer anymore. And that's the basic principle of reciprocity, right? Cute way of saying it, but it's the principle of reciprocity. And the company will keep a customer as long as there's some perceived reciprocity. Now, what you think is reciprocity might be very different. Somebody's just like, I just want a cheap product and I want the functionality and this is reciprocity. Others, they don't really care about the product quality, but it's just amazing to be a customer of this great brand, of this founder that's also trying to go into space and has Cybertrucks and electric cars. So I was like, whoa, that's all they need. So there's a certain kind of reciprocity, and you have to find out what is the thing that customers want to get from you in order to stay with you. And as I said, right, these could be very many different things. And that basic concept of reciprocity, I don't think is stumping anybody. What is stumping, or what's the problem then, is that we need to remember that it's the case. And if we try to suck customers dry at every corner, this is not a sustainable position in the long run. But also the question is then, what do you want back? This is like in any relationship. Mark, maybe from you, I don't want a beer. Maybe from you, I want a really interesting conversation about customer experience. Or you tell me about how it was to be in the CXBA board. It's super interesting, and that'd be enough. I don't need you to pay for the beer. But what is that? And that's the question behind that value research. Now, even if we believe that it's important to understand the reciprocity, I now need to do the right research to understand my different target groups and what it is that they want. And usually, they just don't just want one thing, right? They want several things, and I need to find out which ones.
Yeah, and are you familiar with Joe Pine? Have you ever heard the name?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Of course.
So Joe wrote The Experience Economy, and he talked a lot earlier about this idea of mass customization and how personalization and individualization of the experiences is so important. And now what he's talking about is this idea of marketing is going to go the way of customering, and that there are no segments, that there's just a segment of one. There's an individual here. So what his most recent conversations, he's coming out with another book, maybe it's out already, is this idea of not only is there just a customer of one, but now it's one customer with different modes.
Yes.
So if I may want a beer at Oktoberfest, I might want a beer at home, I might want a beer at a wedding, I might want a beer at a pub, and each one of those would be considered a different value creation set.
Yes,
for
absolutely,
me.
Absolutely. And that's always been the case.
I'd be willing to pay different amounts for the beer in each one of those scenarios.
But the thing is, that's always been the case, right? There's always been the case that people in different, like even 10 years ago, do I go into Starbucks on my lunch break to be by myself, or do I go there with a date? And then I don't want to be by myself. I wonder, maybe it's a new date that I've never see him before and I want to be in public. Very different modes, but the same person. That's why also it's so interesting when you see some of the research that gets done on customer needs. That's where it really breaks down. Because I'm not just Maxie. I'm Maxie the professional, keynote speaker, blah, 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 right? It's very serious. Also Maxie the mother who's sometimes thinking, oh my God, how do I do this with these kids? Then I'm also Maxie the silly goose that makes jokes with her husband. And these different people show up. But I do still believe in the concept of simplifying this a little bit, right? So we do have certain people who have certain mindsets, and we actually just did some data analysis at Forrester to get exactly at that. So I can tell you a little bit about this, but there's kind of certain types of situations that we could focus on. Because if you have this kind of big matrix, imagine a big matrix, right? In the rows, you have the different situations. In the columns, you have the different types of people or personas. The complexity is really great. Now, at some point in the future, we might be able to handle that better also because customers might tell you which situation they're in on purpose because they want to get a specific service, right? So we can talk about that also, but right now that's very complicated. And when people think about this, they typically, oh God, that's so complicated, might as well not start. And that's why I'm saying that there's a specific types of buyers and or decision makers, and there's specific types of situations. And this analysis that we did was we looked at what drives value for customers. We did an analysis. We used a technique called maximum difference scaling, MaxDiff, or MaxiDiff, as a colleague said. So that MaxDiff scaling that helps a little bit get at actual priorities because it forces the person who answers the question to make choices, right? You don't get to say everything's important. You have to always pick the most and least important thing out of a group of 4, and you see like 10 or 12 cards of that, which means that over time you'll have compared many of the things to each other. This is basically a really advanced way to do cool ranking, and it is more than ranking. It also tells you how important something is compared to something else. So if something has 20% importance and something has a 40% importance, the 40% is exactly double as much. So it's not just ranking, but also the relative value, which is cool, right? So that we did, and we can talk about this, but we used that data and clustered it. And we found that there's different kind of clusters of people. There's this one cluster that is totally price sensitive. They basically just look at, it needs to be the lowest possible price. I want to get a discount, and it needs to also have some functionality. So, reliability should be okay, but the price needs to be low, low, low. That's the kind of value for money segment. There was another segment that was price didn't play a role at all. Price had like a super low value for them in terms of importance. What was important for them was all of the functionality stuff. I want to solve a problem, be able to solve a problem. This needs to be reliable. All the features I want must be there. So these are basically the people that I want it just the way I want it, and I'll be willing to pay for it. Second segment, right? The third segment was the people who also didn't have a high value on price, but they looked very much at the characteristics of the brand. So is the brand doing stuff that I agree with values-wise? Is the brand maybe sustainable? Is the brand one that keeps my personal data safe? That's the third segment. And then there was one segment that kind of used many of these factors in their purchase decisions, but not any of them really strongly. So that's kind of like these balanced man in the middle, right? So you have these kind of like these people that are really into the values. And by the way, values, whatever your values are, right? I don't mean the specific bend of values, does not matter at all, but values-based buyers, kind of the quality-based buyers, price-based buyers, and then these, everything is kind of important-based buyers. And that's what I'm trying to say is that with this data, we created these kind of groups. And I think every company can find similar groups among their customers as a simplification to get started with this idea that value drivers are different. But this is not a complete complexity that we cannot solve for. We can solve for this.
Yeah. Would leaders be tempted? Like one question as you're sharing this breakdown, I think it's fascinating, and we may be getting a crash course inside of Maxie's head. Some of the research you've been working on, but I would be curious. Like, I hear the CFO in my head saying, "Okay, well, which one of those groups is going to give us the highest ROI?"
Yes, and that's the thing that then every company, like we did this data based on a large, huge consumer survey. But of course, we don't have the spend attached to that. So that's the second step. You're completely right. what is it that they want and how valuable are these customers to us and is it worth it? Because I'm not, just mind you, I'm not arguing that the customer is always right.
Yeah.
We know by now that that's not, but I do want to, what you want to find, you know what you want to find, Mark, as a leader? You want to find what we call at Forrester devotees. And devotees are these customers that value what you do so much that they reward it with their loyalty. And the loyalty could be how they speak about you, what they buy from you, that they give you feedback, that they forgive you, whatever that is, right? Different people can maybe give you different facets of loyalty. But that's the kind of the customer that ideally you want at the heart of it. And then, of course, you want to have other customers who are ideally close to getting there. And we've done kind of research for that about the last 5 or 6 years. TJ Kidd, a former colleague of mine, started doing research on that, and this fits really well with my value research. So this has been a kind of like a theme for us at Forrester for a long time.
So I'm gonna and we just play a little brainstorming game here. In my class at Michigan State, I teach customer relationship management, and last week we were at the point of loyalty. We talked about customer loyalty, and there's a gentleman, I don't know if you ever heard of him at Vanderbilt, Richard Oliver wrote about Oliver's framework.
Yes.
And he really talks about these different levels of loyalty without getting in too much in the weeds there. But at the end of it, the bottom one he called action loyalty is just a label. But what it really means is essentially that I've got an emotional connection to the brand, and that means I've got what he calls fortitude, which is like sort of a stickiness. It means that not only do I buy, and loyalists, the next level down from that, buy on a regular basis, or repeat purchasers, but this other level. You know, there are people who will defend the brand and stick up for the brand when there's mistakes or shortcomings.
Yes, I think that's very close to what we call devotees. I mean, I think there's luckily there's very similar ideas, right? Comparing your attitudes, your emotions when it comes to loyalty to your behaviors when it comes to loyalty. That's one of the things that many frameworks have in common. Remember that old Walker matrix? On trapped customers. I mean, you've seen it, I've seen it, right? That's a similar idea. But also, I think Esther Perel had this really cool insight. Do you know Esther Perel?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, she does these
relationship. Where should we begin? That's her podcast.
Yes, it's amazing, right? And she has this amazing notion that marriage used to be basically a business transaction. I'm oversimplifying, right? But there's some kind of a business exchange, and now it's evolved into this thing where your spouse is everything to you, right? You exercise together, you raise kids together, you live together, you have fun together, you go on vacation together, and that's a lot to ask from a single person. And the same is true for loyalty, right? If we expect a customer to buy from us and recommend us and forgive us and advocate for us and advocate and do all of these things, then that's a lot to ask. So that's the other question is, remember earlier how we said that you need to figure out what different types of customers want from you? You also need to figure out what they can give you, different types of customers. And maybe it's okay if one customer doesn't buy from you, but they're such vocal supporters. They're so influential, and it's okay. But we don't have often in companies definitions of loyalty that are that nuanced, right? We often look at the behavioral loyalty, or when we don't have that, we look at some kind of proxy like a net promoter score for more like an emotional loyalty. But so the nuance is actually interesting both on the side of what customer can give you and what a customer gets from you.
Yeah, so such a great point you brought up. One of the guests on the show, Fred Reichelt, had recommended, this company mentioned me in London because the question I asked him was, well, okay, if loyalty is so important, and he was specifically talking about referral business being more valuable than business you buy. And so, but how do you track referrals? And he goes, well, it's been a challenge, but it's doable. This company mentioned me has done it in the B2C side. And he shared this, Andy Cockburn, who's the CEO, shared the story of a woman who is in London, and this florist who's the biggest in Europe, I don't remember the name of it, but I'm sure you would be familiar with it. And she was a lost client as they go back and look at history. And she left 9 months ago. But when they tracked the referrals, you talked about influencers, she was responsible for $250,000 in business.
That's crazy. That's the unparalleled theory of loyalty. Yes.
They can go back and track that now through AI and look at the network. Obviously, there needs to be some way to track identifier, like unique identification number for that customer. Maybe a little bit harder in B2B or B2G, whatever. But to your point is that influencers could also be a missed opportunity or a hidden gem.
Correct, but also they're really hard to manage, right? That's but you're right, and there's so many people who try to think about how can they turn their happy customers into influencers. That is a whole field of vendors and research just based on that. Yeah, I agree. It might be a missed opportunity.
So let me because I want to just talk about some strategies, and we've already talked about some, but just to give people here's some action steps. Here's some things that maybe you can either think about or begin to think about where you are. And so let me do my best to try and recap some you've already touched on, and maybe there's one or two that I missed or we didn't get to. One is you talked about this idea of trust and leveraging the trust that you have. So ask yourself maybe, what trust do I have with my customer base? Why would they trust? What have I done to earn the trust? What can I do to earn more trust? And if there's an opportunity with customers that we'd like to attract to our business, what can we do to earn more trust with them?
Yes, and by the way, what does trust even mean? Like many people say, oh, we want our customers to trust us, but what do you mean by that? Do you want them to trust you to do what's best for them, or do you want them to think that you're fulfilling your promises, or that you're empathetic, or that you're competent? Like even defining what is trust for us, because it's such a big word, you cannot measure that. And as soon as you try to put metrics to that, you actually have to define what this means. So break down trust into a few kind of levers of trust, and then measure those. May I add that to your recommendation?
Yeah, please. That's what I'm hoping for.
Hereby adding this to your recommendation.
Someone who's spent an awful lot of time learning about trust, I 100% appreciate your bringing this up and the complexity of it, but yet it's still incredibly important.
Correct.
For an organization.
Yes. And that we talked about this earlier. Remember how we talked about the fact that sometimes it's hard to figure out what customers want, and it might be daunting. And very often we also talk about the fact that, why don't you consider the customer in your decisions? And why not ask one single question? If I do this and the customer finds out about it, will they lose trust? That would be a super simple question to ask for a business decision that you make. So really pragmatic as a takeaway to ask something specific, not like, the customer in the room, but will this customer lose some of their trust in us if we do this? Yeah. That's something we can do tomorrow.
I just wrote a post which taps on what you just said about Starbucks, because they've come out with this new policy that says that there's going to be no free restroom use, no hanging out unless you buy a product from us. And it goes directly against something that they came out with in 2018 after some bad press happened in Philadelphia. So how do you enforce people coming? I had people on the post in LinkedIn write about, well, what if I'm there as part of a group and we're having a meeting there and I just had lunch, but other people are buying coffee. Are they going to ask me to leave?
You know what, Mark? I think this is such an important topic because the company has set expectations at some point that you're all welcome, and they've benefited from that. They've publicized it. They've taken all the PR from it, and now they're taking it back. But now the downside isn't necessarily only on Starbucks. Of course, there's negative PR. You write about it, others write about it. But who is actually having to shoulder this burden? It's the poor people in the Starbucks that have to say, oh, excuse me, ma'am, sir, you haven't bought anything. Do you want to leave? Like, so the downside is all on these people in the front line. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind also as we write about this topic, that there's people on the front line that now have to deal with this and have to deal with irate customers who, maybe they should get over themselves, but also they have been promised something that now gets taken away. And we know how it is when you take things away from people.
But your question is great because it is, how is this going to be a plus or a minus on trust?
Right.
You brought up the idea of understanding the loyalty levers. I'm going to describe it. What is it that generates loyalty from the customer's perspective in your business? So understand what those drivers are, and then you mentioned reciprocity. So over the relationship, because that's really what we're talking about, a relationship. What is it that you need to give to them and they need to give to you to make the relationship thrive over the long term?
Exactly. Basically, what loyalty behaviors do you care about in your customers? And that might be different ones. And based on that, understand what value perceptions create those loyalty behaviors. And we know, for example, that customers of Patagonia are extremely loyal because they get value from doing business with a sustainable company. Customers of Hermes might be extremely loyal because they get status from wearing the scarf and it says Hermes on it, and like, oh, I'm so special. There's this kind of this even as you're trying to think about this, there's different ways that customers get value, and that will also translate into different ways of showing their loyalty. And I can't afford a Hermes scarf, but I've just mentioned them 2-3 times, so I'm maybe an influencer now.
The other thing that I think you said, which I don't know if it's a strategy, but I think it's definitely a mindset, which is this idea of simplify. Mm-hmm. Because you could easily get overwhelmed and just say, hey, I'm not going to even look at that. I'm not going to go down that road. But simplification is just so important.
Yes. Take one journey, one customer journey. And by the way, by journey, I don't mean the life cycle. There's no end-to-end journey. I mean the path to a specific goal. Open a bank account, get a credit card, get a loan, whatever that is, right? And translate this into other industries. So take a specific journey and figure out what is the customer goal and where in this journey currently is a customer gaining value or losing value. For example, when you make it very hard for a customer to accomplish something, they have to put a lot of effort in. That's a value loss. When you treat them super nicely and they feel like, oh, wow, I'm so special, that's a value gain. When they get a discount, that's a value gain. When they see suddenly that you offer them the same thing more expensively than others, that's a value loss. And you can just imagine a journey in front of you, and underneath you don't put the emotional curve, you put a value gain, value loss curve. Right? So now you can think about an individual journey and think about how much of that journey is actually in value loss territory versus value gain territory. And can you afford it? If too much of the journey is in value loss territory, why should that customer go on another journey with you? That's like your beer and you and me on a beer. I'd never not go with you again, right? If it's all just value loss, which it wouldn't be, I know. And now, Mark, you do the same thing for the company. My colleague Joanna de Quintanilla and I, we just published something about energy givers and energy takers on LinkedIn. Also, everybody can see that there. But the underlying concept is that you take the value curve for customer, value gains and loss for the customer, and the value curve for the company, value gains and losses for the company. And you compare that. And then you know where to focus in your journeys, where you need to focus your efforts to optimize both, not to blow the value for the customer out of the water. That's not what this discussion is about, as we've just talked about. It's about the reciprocity and optimization across both customer and business.
This is just so much value in one podcast episode. I'm not even sure if it's legal.
We have to ask the audience if they agree, remember?
There you go. Touche.
No, thank you for the compliment. I shouldn't have. But yes, but it's really important that we, you know what, that's maybe the one important thing I'd like everybody to take away. Stop saying we deliver value, because that is not true. A customer perceives value. We might co-create it, but we can't deliver it. And that matters not because of the language police, but the language we use shapes our actions. And so...
Yeah, so true. And it's a great point to remember. I just also think it was a 2.0 thing that you said. Those of us who have done journey maps many times, you know that emotions are one of the things that differentiates it from a business process map, right? We're looking at the emotions. But what you're saying is, I know, think about the value, and then to go another step is, how does that value trajectory map to the business's value trajectory? And that should open up a bunch of insights in terms of business strategy.
Yes, I think so. Yes.
And also this idea of understanding what your loyalty drivers are and dialing those up or down where they're just not, AARP example, where they're just not of value.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that is fantastic. We have had so much fun. I've got to ask you one more question, though, that I ask all my guests, which is, what advice would you give to your 20-year-old self?
Start earlier to wear glasses so I look older. No, just joking. No, you know what? I would say that to not necessarily have this really strict plan where the career is going. Especially now, I see that a lot, and people ask me, "So, Maxi, how did you make it from this step to the next?" And much of my career was being open to opportunities. And that's something I would tell my 20-year-old self to have a plan, have some thoughts, and try to find opportunities, but then also be open and not thinking you need to have it all mapped out, because that feels a bit constricting, but also it might not be possible. So then you're mapping out something that you don't like. This is just like mapping out a birth plan, and then not being able to deliver that way, and then you're like disappointed. And why would you be disappointed at your birth? I mean, at your child's birth.
Yeah.
So that's the one thing that I think I did right. The thing that I did wrong is I often thought too much about what others think of me, but that might be a problem of the people like me. So not everybody has that problem, but that's also another thing that kindness and respect is important, but you need to know what's right for you.
Great advice. Dr. Maxie Schmidt. What is a way, if somebody wanted to get a hold of you, reach out to you, ask for your help or support, what would be the best way for them to reach out to you?
So if you want to reach out to me personally, LinkedIn is the way to go. You can easily reach me there. And if you want to have my help in the Forrester capacity, then email me at mschmidt@forrester.com.
Excellent. Maxie, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you. It was really a pleasure for me. And can the audience please tell us if this was valuable and useful? I'd like that. I'd like to know that.
Perfect.
Cool.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Delighted Customers podcast. It would mean so much if you would take a moment to subscribe. You can go to Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts, click on the plus sign or follow button, and that will ensure that you don't miss an episode, and it helps get the word out to others. While you're there, I'd love it if you'd leave a 5-star review. I look forward to seeing you back here next Thursday.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's LIBSYN, ads.com today.